Good evening. I'm Dr. Reginald Broadnax, editor of the A.M.E. Zion Quarterly Review, and this is Practical Conversations, conversations for the life of the church. The life of the church includes not only its proclamation, but also the vibrancy of its people in the promotion and enhancement of the kingdom of God. Practical Conversations intends to engage conversations of practice and theology with persons currently working in the church at various levels and engaged in these issues. Our goal is to both inform and enhance those who are actively seeking to enhance God's kingdom through the use of their gifts. Tonight's conversation centers around a new series entitled Preaching During a Pandemic: The Rhetoric of the Black Preaching Tradition, co edited by Dr. Andre E. Johnson and Dr. Kimberly P. Johnson, who was also a former member of the faculty at Clinton College. And also, one of the editors is Dr. Wallace C. Baxter III. This new two-volume series explores the rhetorical tradition of the Black church. In particular, it focuses on that tradition during the global COVID-19 pandemic. Taken from the series introduction, the sermons published addresses these questions. How are the sermons incorporating and infusing COVID-19 in the sermons? What shape did the prophetic and priestly sermonic tradition take when preaching during a pandemic? Were specific models or types of sermons, such as womanist, prophetic, liberation, narrative, contemplative, celebrative, expository, thematic, induction, deduction, more frequently employed during a crisis? The collection of these sermons explored these preaching traditions through an unprecedented global pandemic. This series stands in a line of published Black sermons that goes back even to the work of Bishop James Walker Hood. Probably the first work of published sermons was by a Black person was by Alexander Crummill, entitled "The Future of Africa: Addresses and Sermons Delivered in the Republic of Liberia," published in 1862. The second work of published sermons was by Bishop James Walker Hood, entitled The Negro in the Christian Pulpit, or The Two Characters and Two Destinies, as delineated in 21 practical sermons. This work was published in 1884 and included not only sermons by Bishop Hood, but other Zion ministers as well, including Bishop John Jamison Moore and Bishop Singleton Thomas Jones. This two-volume series brings forward into our current crisis a tradition of Black preaching that dates back to some of Zion's greatest preachers. It is in this that I am happy to have as our guest tonight the Reverend Heather S. Wills, who is an associate minister at the Greater Walters Church in Chicago. She has a sermon included in Volume 1 entitled "Do Not Pass Me By." Reverend Wills, welcome to Practical Conversations.
Thank you
To our
so much.
audience, thank you. To our audience, if you have questions or comments, you can place those in the chat and we will be able to see them. Reverend Wills, I was struck by your sermon, which for our audience is taken from Exodus chapter 11. I was struck because of its optimism. Here we were in the midst of a global shutdown. Persons were dying each day by the tens of thousands, and you say in your sermon, and I quote, "God is saying that in these chaotic times, peace is available to us." You go on to say, "In chaotic times, God's peace is evident through our trust in God's plan, God's protection over our lives, and our confidence in God's promises." Tell us about your optimism and what led you to write this sermon.
So, thank you again for this opportunity to have this conversation and to raise the truths about the lives that we live. And COVID, of course, is one of those big truths about our current affairs. 2020, when COVID hit, I was in my final year of seminary at Chicago Theological Seminary. And I was ironically taking one of my final classes, preaching the headlines.
Mm.
And so that class started in January, and COVID hit right at the top of March.
Yeah.
And so once it hit, we were tasked to write about what we were experiencing. And so this sermon was written around May. And around that time, we were about 2 months into COVID and just really seeing the possibility of its destruction. And now we have really seen what it has done. And in seminary, especially about to graduate, in a place of deconstruction, especially, I had to find optimism. And I have found, not just in seminary, but through my life's journey, that you have to keep optimism in order to stay grounded and in order to get through. I found that has been some of the anchor of a lot of the sermons I have written before and after this one. Um, and leaning into peace, leaning into trust, leaning into relationship seems to be thematic for the calling God has given me, and hopefully has been liberating for those who have experienced this devastation, so that they can recognize that in the midst of it, there is peace available if you so choose to seek and find it.
I was very struck by that. Thinking back in my own situation to April, May of 2020, peace was the last thing I was able to find during those days. I had just experienced the death of a brother. So, peace and was not for me at that time, but you were able to see peace there. And you talk in this sermon about the health disparities that you were experiencing in your placement. Tell us, how did you seek peace in the midst of that kind of injustice?
You know, I'm a minister, right? But by vocation, I am a union organizer. I organize healthcare workers here in Chicago, and across our states. And so watching folks go to work every single day and put their lives on the line, you have to give some level of peace to folks. You have to give some level of optimism. You can't, in my work, sit in the sadness of what is occurring. You have to pick yourself up and face it with some level of peace and chaos. And we see and we glean from folks like, Moses and Exodus and others throughout the biblical stories who show us that in the midst of chaos, folks were enslaved, right? And they had to find some level of trust in God. And that's what we find Moses here in this passage of Exodus talking about telling Pharaoh that, listen, I'm going to trust God's plan. It might not look peaceful right now. I talk about this in the sermon. They had just went through plagues, that the
Mhm.
Egyptians and the Israelites alike, a series of plagues, right? So they have seen and have lived destruction. But Moses marches into Pharaoh's courts and says, you have to let us go, essentially. And I'm going to even double down, Moses says, in my trust of God, and speak to you right in your face and let you know this is what's going to happen. But God is going to protect us. And that is what God showed me in that moment, right? And it's similar to you and similar to so many of us, right? We have lost family members, we have lost friends, we have lost church members to this virus that ravaged communities, particularly to your point around health disparities, Black communities. Um, but we have to find peace, because when we don't find peace, that is when we find depression. When
Yeah.
we don't find peace, that is when we find sadness and sticking in that situation. It is only through our desire to be at peace that we can therefore find peace, but that peace must be found in God.
Yes, yes. Let me take the opportunity and privilege to welcome and say hello to our missionary supervisor, Mrs. Lavetta Holmes. It's so good to see you and to know that you're watching tonight. In terms of the health disparities that you saw, um, most people well, I shouldn't say most people. Media and those types of persons did not understand the disparities that were happening, particularly in communities of color. Help us understand what those disparities were that you were seeing, and have they gotten any better?
In August of 2020 here in Chicago, going into 2021, we watched and stood against a hospital in a Black community attempt to close in Chicago, Illinois. That hospital was Mercy Hospital at that time.
Mm,
They were already closing many sections of the hospital, removing resources right from our communities, right under our noses.
mm,
And they attempted to close it. It is disparities like that that are evident. You're going to tell me you're going to remove resources from folks right in the middle of a pandemic because, in your opinion, the numbers don't line up. To put profit over people in many sectors, not just healthcare, right? We see that when we claim people are essential workers but don't pay them well. We see disparities across all sectors of really capitalism. But to understand that in Black communities, resources are being pulled daily. Has that gotten better? I can't fully say yes. I can't say that as a Black woman on the South Side of Chicago, I have the same access to resources as counterparts on other sides of our city that might even line up with me with gender and race background. But what I do recognize is that in order to organize forward, in order to move forward, just as Moses did, Moses found peace in his chaos by recognizing that he had to organize his people forward. And so we did that here in Chicago. And likewise, we have to continue that momentum. That is where we'll find peace, when we find justice. We
yeah.
found peace in making sure that hospital stayed open, changed owners, and is now a place that is providing resources to the community in which it resides. And that is probably some of the energy Moses tapped into when he found justice for his people. And I think that the work of peace is not just stagnation. The work of peace is recognizing that in the midst of what is going on, I will remain sure-footed and flat-footed and grounded.
At the beginning of the pandemic, the beginning of the shutdown, we celebrated persons who that we had just not paid attention to, who we had not given any thought to previously. But at the beginning of the pandemic, they're now essential workers, and we need them, and we clapped for them, we cheered for them. But if I remember correctly, by about fall, there was this call for persons to return to work, and for businesses to reopen, and persons to get back into the economy. As an organizer, as a union organizer, how did you experience persons being forced to go back to work when there was no yet cure for a global pandemic?
Regretfully for the sector I organize in, folks never left work, right? I organize
Mm,
with home care workers and hospital workers, right? Child care providers, nursing home workers. These folks never got a break. These folks never got vacation days. These folks never got a chance to work from home. That's not conducive for the work that they provide and the care that they provide. And so I had to work with them through their own grief, right? Of watching patients and clients and loved ones pass away, be sick, watching coworkers pass away.
mm,
And so these folks are still working to this day, taking care of now the next group of folks who are
sure.
being admitted to these services, right? Especially as we see in our economy the increase in baby boomers, right? Now retiring and needing homebound services, et cetera. As just the course of life takes us, we see that folks are needed more than ever in healthcare. And we even see that post pandemic, and I use that loosely because I'm not sure if we're really post-pandemic, but post the height of the crisis, um, folks were not given resources and still aren't. And I'm not just talking PPE, right? But I'm talking mental health resources. I'm talking vacation days for healthcare workers to be able to sit back and relax their own minds. There has never been a break for essential workers. And it's, to our point, not just healthcare workers, these are grocery store workers, these are truck drivers, right? This is everyone who had to continue to move our country and our world when folks like even myself were able to work remotely.
This is Practical Conversations, conversations for the life of the church. Tonight, we're discussing a new series of published sermons entitled Preaching During a Pandemic. Our guest tonight is the Reverend Heather Wills, who is an associate minister at the Greater Walters Church in Chicago. She has a sermon published in this series entitled Do Not Pass Me By. We're happy to have her tonight and to discuss her sermon. Reverend Wills, you were just speaking of the essential workers, the healthcare workers who did not have a break during the pandemic and even now after the pandemic. How then did you speak optimism to those persons as you were working with them during these difficult times?
We speak optimism in the preach community, right, by referencing the word. And that's where I went, right? I went right to places of stories of folks that I knew might have experienced the same things that we were experiencing, which led my spirit to this excerpt of Exodus. And that is what we do as ministers, as preachers, if you will. We go to the word, we go to language and to knowledge that will uplift in the midst of. And I think that ministers are called to do that because life is heavy and life is difficult and life can keep you down if you aren't having someone, or at least encouraging yourself, right, but to speak life into you.
Now, you
And
just made a
so
move. Excuse me, you just made a move there. I asked about optimism in a pandemic. You said life is heavy. You're suggesting that the optimism that you speak of and the need to proclaim optimism isn't just for a pandemic, but for everyday situations.
I believe that's true. I believe that biblical application can be made to specificity, but it's a book of instruction for our life. And so the tools that we can use in one situation, certainly we can use in another. But I am grounded in believing that peace is one of our key elements to having a good life.
You say in your sermon, God's presence and peace was promised to the Israelites before this moment in their history, just as God's presence and peace in our lives was promised to us before this moment in our history. Speak of this promise that God gives to us.
Well, I would believe many Christians would believe that our promise is in Jesus Christ, right? And that is the premise of our Christianity, the promise of God turning many, what we would consider with our carnal eyes, impossible situations into possible ones. From Jesus's birth all the way to Jesus's resurrection, we see God's intervention, and that is the cornerstone, if you will, of everything that we are to believe. And I find in stories of Jesus's life, not only Jesus's death, but also Jesus's life, a reminder, and many other biblical stories, but a reminder that in the midst of chaos, Jesus lived chaos from the time his public ministry started until the day of his resurrection, perhaps. And looking at his life stories, we have to recognize that God must be in the midst if Jesus's life, death, and resurrection is what we believe in. And if we therefore believe in Jesus alone, that can be enough to assure us that God's peace, protection, and provision is available for us as well.
in your sermon, you speak of those days in 2020 as chaotic times. And you reference that or correlate that to the chaotic times that the Israelites were experiencing under the hands of Moses. Um, how do you find Jesus and the peace that he gives when you're in the midst of chaotic times?
Yeah, that's your faith, I believe. I believe that is what your faith is. That is what your faith becomes and it blossoms. And even in the published work, although it might have been specific to coronavirus at that time, I can look back and say chaos was not just occurring in the healthcare world, right? But us as Black folks saw it occurring in our political world. And trying to find chaos, even as an organizer, as we watch folks march through the streets, as we watch folks be killed, as we watch folks be disenfranchised, even to this moment, has to be a daily retooling of even my faith to ground myself and recognize our humanity in life, that we have to every day get up and choose, as I heard a good pastor say this morning, choose God, choose happiness, choose peace. So that is what hopefully not only my life's work shows, but my preach work shows, that every day we are choosing God amidst what is going on.
Choosing God. That's an interesting concept. That we have a choice each day to choose God or say choose chaos, to choose God or to choose the ways of the world. Um, is there anything that can help us with that choice as we arrive at each new day?
It's going to take personal relationship, personal studying, personal time, because it's love and peace, which is God, right? All those are synonymous, or it's chaos. And so I don't believe, or I haven't experienced just falling into peace. I had to search for it, dig for it, and intentionally find it. I believe, through my life's experience at least, that is true for others. And I believe that is also why the written word stresses that so much. The written word stresses that times are hard, right? Trouble will come. These are all colloquial Black church terms that we use, but when we really apply them, they just tell us that life is going to be hard, but you're going to have to choose that joy comes in the morning. Well, when we say joy comes in the morning, we're not in the morning yet. We're using our faith to be hopeful for peace. So we then believe trouble don't last always. It's just a reframing of these same tools that what they say Big Mama said. It's just a reframing of those same beliefs. But you have to choose that daily, I believe, because life can be defeating. And it is your faith that takes you to the next level to be able, like I said, to be peaceful in chaotic times.
Yes. Let me just remind everyone watching that if you have questions or comments, you can place those in the chat and I'll be able to see them and be able to address those as they come forward. Reverend, in your sermon, you also not only do you speak of God's peace, but you also speak of God's protection. And one of the things that was interesting is that you tie God's protection to the only source of protection we had at the time, May, June of 2020, to wearing masks. As much as they were maligned in a certain segment of our society, you found that masks were part of God's protection. How do you understand human means of protection as also being God's means of protection?
By equating discernment and common sense. It might be a far-fetched idea, but Protection from God is you using your godly wisdom and discernment to make the best decision. It's not God having some magic wand and placing you in some clear box and parading you around in the midst of what's going on around you. It's you making wise decisions. And not only that's not the only definitive of protection, surely, but in this situation, it can surely be applied in that way. We had to mask up, socially distance, close churches
Mm-hmm.
to be mindful that we cannot be foolish about what's happening around us. We cannot ignore what is going on. And that type of wisdom, even when our bishops came out pretty early in those months and said, close the churches, that type of wisdom is godly protection. And that is what we have to ask God to do, to guide us to make good decisions also in the midst of chaos, so that, hopefully we aren't harmed more. Of course, with the pandemic, with the health crisis, there were obviously unavoidable circumstances and situations where people lost their lives. And that's one of the heaviest parts of even my sermon, is to know in hindsight how many people, my own relatives, who are not here anymore,
Mm-hmm.
and even trying to find peace amidst that. But you just have to retool your mind and choose God, choose love, choose peace.
To be alliterative, we talked about peace, we talked about protection, but another P in your sermon was also God's plan. You saw what was taking place as part of the plan of God. Talk about how you understood a global pandemic as being part of the plan of God.
I think more or less my understanding is the way that we are to respond to the global pandemic should be a part of the plan of God. And what I mean by that is coming from the lens of a social justice minister, even when we look at what God has orchestrated us to do as far as taking care of one another, being mindful that we are not on this planet alone, but we have to share space with other folks. Even that story needing to be told to Pharaoh ultimately, that would lead to the emancipation of Moses's people. We have to be mindful that we are not just walking through life alone. And so our plan individually is connected with other folks. And so when we think about how our lives should be going forward on a daily basis, it's more or less for us to be introspective, that our daily walk going forward, even through the pandemic and thereafter, has to be inclusive of other folks. And so God's plan, once again, is not some magical spaceship in the sky. It's really how us as Christians live every day through sharing our faith, doing the right thing, etc., that can really show folks that God is light and truth and justice. And so it's really a call to action. And as an organizer, that is what I often do. Lead with the call to action. What will you do going forward from this moment? And God's plan is for us to take up the charge, to be responsible in the moment that we're living, to consider others, and to really think forward, so that once we come out of this moment, we have even more to not only be grateful for, but to work toward even then further.
You are watching Practical Conversations, Conversations for the Life of the Church. Our discussion tonight centers around a new series of sermons published this year entitled Preaching During a Pandemic. Our guest tonight, Reverend Heather Wills, is a associate minister at the Greater Walters Church in Chicago, and she has a sermon published in this series entitled Do Not Pass Us By. Reverend Wills, you were just speaking of how you understood God's plan to be inclusive of others, which is so counter to our culture being so individualistic, but God calls us to care for others. How have you been able to help person's, well, in your work as an organizer, how have you been able to help others to see that helping others is really a way in which we help ourselves?
I would say that leans more into the work I do as a community organizer. The work I do as a union organizer really lends more to folks finding power within themselves and lifting themselves up. And in the community, I would pray that it would become the same, but in the community, I'm more or less tasked with making sure that folks have what they need, have the resources they need to just get by. And that comes in a myriad of ways, but the ways that I'm called to do it is relative to political education. Um, and so as we move forward, not only in coming out of a pandemic that we say loosely, but also going into an election season, I think that it's most mindful right now. I'm sorry, that it's most important right now that we be mindful of educating ourselves and our communities about who we're going to put in office. And the reason that's critical is because the folks who are in office were the folks who decided where the money was going during the pandemic, who was getting the resources, who was getting the vaccines. The folks in office, our elected officials, speak directly to our daily quality of life, whether we know it or not. And so I am in the place where I'm trying to let folks know it and make sure folks know it and are engaged in elected officials, both locally and federally, so that we know that the people that we are putting in office have our best interests at heart. And when we come to times such as a pandemic or any other crises, that we know we will have the resources that we need.
In your sermon, you speak about the then president, who at the time was being xenophobic and is still being xenophobic today. So we should be mindful of that. But well, I'm in North Carolina, and a lot of places here in North Carolina, people don't believe that the church should be politically active. They think that the political sphere, the political arena, is not something that the church should speak to. How do you feel about that?
I think that's counterintuitive, especially to Black life in America. I know that to be true because, as we know, most of the history of the Black church, even the AME Zion church, is deeply political. But we see a shift around the 80s into the 90s in the church because of the change in dynamic in who is quote unquote running the movement. And so we see when the power is not centralized in the church anymore, the church no longer wants to do with the leaders of the movement. And when church leaders are no longer centralized in church beliefs, the church no longer wants to support. And so what we have to recognize is that we are only doing ourselves a disservice when we stop educating ourselves, not just about politics, but as you said in your last conversation, about anything regarding life. That the church is not just a place where folks should be coming to hear a sermon and getting in their cars or in their modes of transportation and going their ways. That it can serve as a vehicle in the community to serve the community, to provide resources. And they range from youth resources to voting resources. But there are many ways that the church must now address the intersection of life. There is an intersection of life, particularly Black life. And when we ignore it, we ignore Black folks. And then we wonder why our churches are empty. And it probably leans to believe that it's because we have ignored our congregants.
So that education, not just in scripture, but education in the community, education in the political life, education in civil affairs, local affairs, is part of the ministry of the church.
Yeah. I mean, by and large, if we are not well rounded people, then we will not have a well rounded life. And we know even today, we don't have to seek back into the 60s and the 70s. We can see today the disenfranchisement in our communities. Even here in Blue City, Blue State, Chicago, we can see the disenfranchisement in our communities. You came from St. Mark, Chicago. You know what 74th and Cottage Grove looks like. And We have two churches on Cottage Grove that sit blocks from each
Yes.
other. So we know in our communities what they look like. And the truth is that if we are not involved in the lives of our congregants, at least, right? Let's start somewhere, perhaps, with our congregants, with what they need, meeting their needs where they are. And we come out of this old notion and traditionalism of forcing folks to acquiesce to the church's demands, but recognizing that the church is a hospital where you serve people, not to be served, then perhaps we will see a resurgence of our traditional Black churches. But in the meantime, churches still exist and they pop up everywhere, and they are non traditional by many means, but they are serving people because God has gone nowhere. People's thirst for God has remained. It's just how they are going to grab God. And if we are to be about ministry in our denomination of the Great Commission and our other called work, that we have to be mindful of how we are going to serve the people that need to be served.
One of the things that distressed me coming into 2021 was this call to go back to work and return to things as normal, whatever normal was. And particularly as we were getting vaccinated, then we were supposed to return to the way things were. Unfortunately, what the way things were was economically and socially unjust. You know, how do we how do we address those concerns even now after we have been vaccinated and we're no longer, well, I won't say, we're not as seriously concerned about coronavirus as we were a year and a half, 2 years ago? How do we address those same issues that were lingering underneath the surface in 19 that were only brought forward and exacerbated during the pandemic?
We lean into them and we organize around them. And we also just allow the moment to show us that we are in our new normal. We have to, as a wise person says, let go of the resistance.
Hmm.
We are so resistant to change, even in our church. How long did it take for many of us to let go of the resistance of these elongated services? I am marveled every Sunday that our services is still remaining about an hour, hour and a half, because we are steeped in tradition and in this thought that we have to do it this way. And if we don't, then something is going to happen. We have to let go of the resistance to change and open our minds and even our hearts to the possibility of doing stuff a different way. I'm a new age preacher, new age person. So
Well,
I
why don't
am
you
not
define that for us? What does it mean to be a new age preacher?
I am not steeped in traditionalism. And it's difficult being in the AME Zion Church and having that framework. But what I recognize for myself, ironically, is that that is where my peace is. But moreover, that being able to be adjustable to what's going on also helps with peace.
Hmm.
And it's kind of when we are hard and hardened in our ways and not flexible that we can't adjust. And of course, that can be applied in many other situations, but particular to even the length of our services. We just have to understand that it's okay to let it go because God is still present despite the ritual and despite the up and down. God is still here, and we can give ourselves permission to connect with God in new ways that will not take our salvation away. Certainly.
You are watching Practical Conversations, Conversations for the Life of the Church. Tonight, we're discussing a new series of sermons entitled Preaching During the Pandemic. Our guest tonight, Reverend Heather Wills, has a sermon published in Volume 1 entitled Do Not Pass Me By. And we're happy to have her tonight to discuss her sermon. Reverend Wills, we began this conversation discussing the optimism in your sermon and the optimism you saw at the beginning of the pandemic. So now that the WHO has declared that the pandemic is over, what do you see now? Where do you see us in terms of our current situation? And are you still optimistic?
I see us at a pivot in our world, in my lifetime at least, where I must remain optimistic that there is a possibility of change forward. We saw here, even in Chicago, political new possibilities of change that were anchored in the moment of the injustices that we knew already lived there, that were, as you said, exacerbated once the COVID pandemic began. And I am hopeful as an organizer, based on what I've seen and even lived, even just recently running for office here in Chicago. And
What
although
part of the
I did
office did
not
you run
win the
for?
office, I'm very hopeful in the residents I live around who want to see change and who are inspired to participate in change. I'm hopeful for the new relationships I've built and the new places those will take me. I'm hopeful for the change that is happening right now, even in my city, where we have passed ordinances to make sure that sub minimum wage workers make minimum wage within the next 2 years. But we have passed ordinances to make sure that there is resources, budget resources available for unhoused folks coming up. Where as we deal with the migrant crisis, we are hopeful that folks are going to get housing, and we are putting together plans to make sure that people have childcare and other resources that they need, mutual aid. So I'm hopeful in the spirit of togetherness. And I think that Moses perhaps might have been hopeful in the same, looking at his people and saying, despite what we have come through, we know what God can take us to. And that is where my hope is anchored, right? And I pray that for others, perhaps that is where their hope is anchored as well, in our faith and in our belief that things are possible. And they're even more possible when we use our own hands to get them done.
You just spoke of togetherness, and you previously talked about God's plan, including our working and helping each other. Um, are you seeing more of that since the pandemic? Are we working with each other better? And if not, what can we do to work together and to bring forward God's plan of helping and loving and working with our neighbors?
I can say that because I have intentionally created a community of networks of folks who are working to do this work, I have seen it, but I'm sure I can look outside of my community, and I'm sure others can share that they might not have hope, that they might feel still defeated. And that is why the hopeful must continue to do the work. That is why I believe my mission, my calling, my purpose is to continue to shine that light in those dark places. Because I recognize that perhaps there might be others who don't have that light, right? And it is my responsibility, as Jesus has commissioned us, to go and share that gospel so that other folks, as we say, can look and say, what must I do to be saved? What must I do to have peace? What must I do to have joy? What must I do to have love? And that is what I lean into every day. And that work is not easy. And that's why I must create community of folks who are also wanting to do this work, so that when it gets heavy for me, I can lean to my sister or my brother and ask for a helping hand or a smile or a joke even. That is why community is important. That is why togetherness is important. And we can look on social media, we can look in news media and see that there are opposing thoughts to this. But there always will be. There is never going to be, and this is a regretful statement that I might make, but we're not going to get to a place of perfection. We often look for some reason to have a worldly experience of perfection, that everyone is going to be on the same page, that everyone's going to have the same belief. That's not going to happen. But what I am tasked with is to continue to move that needle where each person I interact with, I give a little bit more light so they can give light to the next person. And so it is in that type of light sharing that I'm able to create community, and that I use my community to encourage me even to continue to share light. And then I'm able to continue to dig back into my community to fill up my cup again so that I can continue to share that light. It kind of reminds me of every year at our church for Christmas Eve service, Bishop Walker lights the candle, and we all light our candles from that light across the sanctuary. And it's always, especially from the pulpit, an awesome sight to see, to watch the light move from the front, from that one singular candle to the choir stand and to the back, because it shows us how light can move. It's not going to be that Bishop Walker will light every single candle at that one time, but it's going to be by him lighting that candle and the next person lighting another candle, and us sharing light in that way, that we are even able to find optimism that this work is not a heavy lift. You just have to always be willing to do it.
I've mentioned your sermon several times entitled Do Not Pass Me By, and that seems an obvious reference to the hymn, but you were trying to say something else in that title. Tell us what it was that you wanted not to, for us to, or wanted for it not to pass us by.
I think it really comes down to the glory of God, that same glory that Moses felt over himself and even his people in the midst of their own destruction. And that glory of God that we often feel when we might be dismayed, but say, I don't know how God is carrying me through this situation, or I don't know how I got through that, or when we look back over our lives, we should have been. It's that same glory that I'm asking God to not pass by over me. And so, the hymn says, while on others that are calling, do not pass me by. But really, God, don't pass me by with your goodness and with your mercy and with your love, because I need that same covering that you gave to Moses, to his people, when you said that the plague of the firstborn would not touch them. That's the covering that I need. And that's the covering that I'm sure that many of us pray for, even as we leave our homes every day, because life is uncertain. I know living here in Chicago, it can be very discouraging to leave your home if you live in fear, if you live in uncertainty, if you live in hopelessness. But it is only through hope that we can be free and liberated. And it is that hope that I need, God to cover me with daily. So I ask God, don't pass me by. Give me everything you got every day, because I need it all.
You spoke of chaotic times, and certainly 2020 was a chaotic time, but you also told us, or reminded us, that life itself can be chaotic. So, yes, in these chaotic times, in our daily situations, we need God not to pass us by each morning when we go into our various respective jobs and responsibilities. We should say to God, do not pass me by today. And,
Please.
and I understand that not so much as a call of need and protection, but that's also an optimistic message that God's grace not passing us by will give us what we need for that day.
Yeah. And God only tasks us to live day by day. So it's just to get through that day. And sometimes that moment, that situation, that interaction. And I know I need God down to every microscope of moment to moment. So I genuinely ask God, keep me every time so that your will can be done, and so that my life reflects your light.
Do not pass me by. I must think of that song now in a different light and in a different vein, not just something that we would say or would sing during worship, but also something that we would pray each morning. One of the comments that is just on my screen is that "Do not pass me by" is not a competitive message, but it is. I'm thinking of it as contemplative and contemplative, one that can be prayerful, one that we can utter as our prayer for the day, that God's grace would not pass us by. Amen. Reverend Wills, we thank you tonight for joining us for our practical conversation and for the opportunity to discuss your sermon, Do Not Pass Us By, which is part of Volume 1 of a new series of sermons published by Peter Lang and edited by Andre Johnson, Kimberly P. Johnson, and Wallace C. Baxter III. It's on your screen. The title of the series is Preaching During a Pandemic: The Rhetoric of the Black Preaching Tradition. We are so proud to have one of our own Zionites to be published in this series, and we were happy to have her to join us tonight to discuss the sermon and the ministry that she engages there in Chicago. Reverend Wills, thank you for joining us tonight for this practical conversation.
Thank you so much. God bless you and happy holidays.
Thank you, and happy holidays to you, and happy holidays to our audience. For our Zion family, we wish you the highest and the most and the glorious holiday season. We just finished with Thanksgiving, and we are leading into Advent on Sunday and into Christmas. And we wish you the most blessed season, and we look forward to having you to join us for our next conversation, which will be after the new year. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for Practical Conversations.